The file was already open when Prince William walked into the room. No one had told him it would be there. No aide had briefed him. No meeting had been scheduled. Just a sealed envelope sitting flat on the center of the desk, the kind that arrives without explanation and leaves without apology. And a terminal screen glowing soft blue in the early morning dark like a wound that refuses to close. 4:12 a.m. London outside the window was the color of cold iron. The Thames somewhere beyond the rooftops carried its usual indifference. The grounds below were empty, still. The kind of still that only exists in the hour before the world remembers it has to perform. William stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds before he crossed the room. Hi, viewers. When you find out something was hidden from you by the people closest to you, yes, do you confront them immediately, or do you wait and gather every single piece of information first? Drop your answer in the comments below, because what William does next changes everything. He did not turn on the overhead light. The lamp on the desk was enough. He pulled the chair back with one hand, sat down, and reached for the envelope with the particular steadiness of a man who has trained himself across an entire lifetime to open difficult things without flinching. The seal broke clean. 3 pages, a cover document, 2 attachments. The header read, Internal Estate Review, Restricted Classification, Lady Louise Windsor. His right hand went flat on the desk, stayed there. The first page was legal architecture, trust classification language, estate framework references. That's the kind of formal structure that looks like paperwork until you understand what it is actually doing. William understood. He had been reading documents like this since before most people his age had their first apartment. He scanned the top section quickly, eyes moving with the precise efficiency of someone who processes institutional language the way other people process weather. Automatically, without effort, already calculating consequences before the sentence ends. Then he reached the activation notice. 4 words stopped him cold. Clause threshold conditions met. His jaw did not tighten. His expression did not shift. But his right hand, flat on the desk, pressed down just slightly, the way a person presses down on something when they need to feel that the ground is still solid beneath them. Because those 4 words meant the inheritance was no longer dormant. It was no longer theoretical. It was no longer a quiet arrangement buried inside private estate documents that no one outside a very small circle of attorneys had ever reviewed. It was real, activated, and by the legal language on the page in front of him, it was permanent in a way that made his next 10 minutes the most consequential 10 minutes he had experienced in months. He turned to the second page. The scope was laid out in measured paragraphs. Stewardship authority over a private philanthropic endowment. Curatorial control of a charitable portfolio tied to specific values documented by the late Queen herself. Conservation. Rural community programs. Educational access. Equestrian welfare. Not a palace, not jewels. Not a financial windfall that tabloids could photograph and the public could calculate. Something quieter than any of those things. And because it was quiet, it was permanent in a different way. The kind of permanent that does not announce itself at a ceremony, but instead rewrites the room gradually, one relationship at a time, one institutional connection at a time, until 5 years from now someone looks up and realizes the map of influence looks nothing like it did before. Lady Louise Windsor's name was now tied to the late Queen's legacy, not ceremonially, legally. William turned to the 3rd page. The addendum was 3 paragraphs long. Dense, precise, estate law phrasing stacked like bricks. He read it once, his eyes moving at a half his normal pace. The pace he uses when the words are telling him something he needs to hear exactly right the first time. Then he read it again, his thumb pressed against the corner of the page. The addendum specified that formal activation required written acknowledgement from a member of the direct line of succession. Not approval. Not agreement, acknowledgement. The heir did not hold veto power. He held witnessing authority. He was required to confirm that the activation had occurred and that no legal objection had been raised within the review window. To refuse was to challenge the trust itself. To challenge the trust was to challenge the woman who created it. William set the folder down on the desk, looked at the window. Rushed that the morning outside had moved from iron to ash. That particular London grey that arrives between 4 a.m. and 5 a.m. and belongs to no one, neither night nor day, as if the city is holding its breath while it decides what kind of day it is willing to be. His left hand, which had been resting in his lap, rose to the desk, closed slowly into a loose fist, opened again. He reached for a pen. The phone on the side table rang once, sharp, clean, demanding. He did not reach for it. He already knew who it was. And he already knew that whatever was said in that conversation would be the opening move in something that could not be undone, could not be managed quietly, and could not be explained to the public in a way that left everyone satisfied. Because someone else had seen this file. Someone else had read those same 4 words. And that person was not going to accept them the same way William just had. What do you think Queen Elizabeth was really trying to protect when she wrote this inheritance the way she did? Louise's future or something much larger? Leave your answer below. The attorney's name was Devereux Okafor, 43 years old, sharp, the kind of man who wore silence the way other men wore expensive suits, with complete comfort and total intention. He had been called at 5:47 a.m., before sunrise, before his coffee, before the city outside his window in Gray's Inn had decided what kind of morning it was going to be. The call lasted 90 seconds. He asked 2 questions. He received 1 answer. He was in a car 11 minutes later, a single leather folder pressed flat against his knee, his phone face down on the seat beside him. But he did not call anyone on the way over. That told the people waiting for him everything they needed to know about what was in that folder. The meeting room was already occupied when Devereux arrived. 2 other attorneys sat at the long, polished table. Simone Achebe on the left, silver-framed glasses, a yellow legal pad already half filled with notes in handwriting so small it looked like code, and Marcus Beaumont on the right, older than both of them, a man who had spent 30 years inside the architecture of private estate law and who had the particular stillness of someone who had already seen the worst possible version of this situation and survived it. 3 cars. 3 separate entrances. No press outside. No royal correspondent waiting on the pavement with a recorder and a theory. Just 3 attorneys and a problem that had no clean solution. Devereux set his folder on the table and sat down without greeting anyone. He opened it to page 1. "Walk me through the activation timeline," Simone said. He did, efficiently. No unnecessary words. The clause had been triggered by the convergence of 3 documented conditions: generational succession transition, elapsed time from creation date, and verified conduct threshold. All 3 had aligned within the same 30-day window. The trust's own internal mechanism had flagged the alignment automatically, the way a lock opens when the right combination of numbers finally lines up. Not because anyone pushed it, because the design had always been waiting for this exact moment. "Who logged the activation notice?" Marcus asked. "Estate trustees. Standard protocol?" "Before or after household notification?" Devereux looked at him across the table. "Before." Marcus picked up his pen, put it back down, picked it up again. That small, repeated motion, the only sign, in a man otherwise constructed entirely of composure, that the information had landed harder than he wanted to show. Because that sequence mattered enormously. The activation had been logged, officially recorded, and entered into the restricted estate archive before a single member of any royal household had been formally notified. Which meant the paperwork was complete. Which meant the legal clock had already started. Which meant that every avenue for intervention, every possible mechanism for delay, reconsideration, or review was operating inside a timeline that had already begun moving without anyone's permission. Simone set her pen down on the legal pad. "What's the scope of the stewardship?" she asked, though her expression said she had already read it and was asking Devereux to say it out loud, in this room, so that all 3 of them had to sit with it at the same time. He read from the folder: Philanthropic Endowment Curatorial Authority. Patronage direction over a charitable portfolio documented under the late Queen's personal priority framework. Conservation initiatives. Rural community investment. Educational access programs. Equestrian welfare organizations that had received private royal support for decades. The authority to continue, shape, and represent that work, in the late Queen's name, going forward. The room held that for a moment, not the financial value, that was almost irrelevant. What sat heavy in the silence was what the stewardship actually meant in institutional terms. In a monarchy, patronage is not charity work. Patronage is social architecture. When a name is attached to an organization, that organization carries the weight of that name into every room it enters, every conversation it starts, every relationship it builds with government, press, and public. Lady Louise Windsor's name was now attached to an entire network of organizations that had, until this activation, been operating quietly under the late Queen's legacy umbrella. That network did not just represent good causes, it represented narrative access. "Is there a challenge pathway?" Simone asked. Devereaux turned to the second section of his folder. 3 potential mechanisms. Yet he walked through them with the same clean efficiency he had used on the timeline. Voluntary withdrawal by the beneficiary, possible, but requiring her own decision outside any external pressure. Legal challenge on capacity grounds. He dismissed this in one sentence, and no one in the room pushed back, because everyone understood what that avenue would cost in public damage before it collapsed in court. And the third option, the legacy override mechanism, a rarely cited clause buried inside broader estate management frameworks that theoretically allowed a successor household to petition for trust review under extraordinary institutional circumstances. Marcus looked up from his pad. "Has that mechanism ever been invoked?" Devereaux did not answer immediately. That pause was its own answer. The last documented invocation," he said carefully, "was prior to living memory, and the circumstances that justified it were categorically different from what we are looking at in this room." "Meaning it won't hold," Simone said. "Meaning it won't hold." Simone leaned back in her chair. She took her glasses off and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose, a gesture so brief most people would have missed it. Marcus was already writing again, his pen moving in tight, controlled lines across the yellow pad. Devereaux closed the folder. "Once activated," he said, "the trust is self-executing. The mechanism completes itself. The logged activation is not the beginning of a review process. It is the conclusion of one. Every condition that required meeting was already met before this room convened." The word self-executing sat in the air like a verdict, because that is exactly what it was. In legal terms, self-executing means the document performs its own function. It does not require ongoing cooperation from any party. It does not require approval from any household. It does not pause for discomfort or adjust for politics or wait for everyone in the room to feel ready. The late Queen had not written a document that needed permission to work. She had written a document that simply worked. Simone put her glasses back on, looked at Devereaux across the table. "Who else has read the addendum?" The question was specific. As the addendum, the 3-paragraph section requiring formal acknowledgement from the direct line of succession, was the one piece of the trust that required active human participation. Everything else was automatic, but the acknowledgement had to come from a person, a real signature, a documented confirmation. "William has the folder," Devereaux said, "Satyad. And Camilla's circle?" He reached into the back of his leather folder and removed a single page, placed it on the table between them. It was a written inquiry, formal, measured, institutional in its language, submitted by a senior advisor operating within Camilla's household, requesting clarification on activation protocol, requesting timeline information, requesting documentation on whether a reconsideration window existed. Simone read it once, looked up. They already know. They already know," Devereaux confirmed. Marcus stopped writing. 3 attorneys, 1 table, 1 trust that had just moved from dormant to active in the time it took the city outside to go from pre-dawn dark to early gray morning light. And somewhere across London, in a room none of them had access to, 2 conversations were happening simultaneously. One between William and his own counsel, and one inside Camilla's advisory circle. And the outcome of those 2 conversations, running parallel, invisible to each other, was going to determine what the next 72 hours looked like. One of those conversations was going to push for the acknowledgement to be signed. The other was going to push for it to be delayed. And a delayed signature, in a self-executing trust with a documented activation timestamp, was not a neutral act. It was a challenge. And challenges to private estate documents created by the late Queen carried a weight that no royal household in the current climate could afford to have attached to their name in public. Devereaux picked up his phone for the first time since he had sat down, looked at the screen. One message, sent 3 minutes ago, from a number he recognized. 4 words. He wants a meeting. He set the phone face down on the table. Did not share the message, because the person who had sent it was not from William's team, and the meeting being requested was not about legal review. It was about something that legal language had no category for, the place where institutional strategy ends and personal stakes begin, where the documents stop mattering and the people holding them start mattering instead. And in that place, no clause in any trust, however carefully drafted, could tell you what was going to happen next. If you were in that room with Devereaux, Simone, and Marcus, and you knew that a meeting was being requested, not through legal channels but personally, would you advise William to take that meeting or refuse it entirely? Think carefully before you answer, because the wrong move here does not just affect one family. It affects a legacy that belongs to an entire nation. The folder was already on the desk when William sat down. He had not put it there. That was the first thing he noticed. Not the folder itself, not the weight of what was inside it. Oh, but the fact that someone had placed it in the exact center of his desk with the kind of deliberate precision that communicates a message without using a single word. Centered, squared, waiting. The way a judge places a ruling face down before a courtroom before anyone has been told to rise. He sat, pulled it toward him, opened it. The room around him was the kind of quiet that buildings produce at 6 a.m. when the staff has not yet arrived and the machinery of the day has not yet started turning. No footsteps in the corridor, no phones, no briefings. Just the low sound of his own breathing and the faint tick of the clock on the far wall marking time the way it always did. Indifferently, without opinion, without any awareness that what was happening at this desk at this particular moment was anything other than an ordinary morning. Nothing about this morning was ordinary. William had been reading institutional documents since childhood, not by choice, by design. The preparation for the role he was born into included, among other things, the ability to move through dense legal and administrative language without losing the thread, to hold the formal structure of a document in one part of his mind while tracking its real-world implications in another. It was a skill that looked like calm from the outside. From the inside, it felt like running 2 separate conversations simultaneously, forever. He turned to page 1. The trust classification sat at the top of the first page in clean formal type. He read the estate framework references without slowing down. He knew this architecture, had seen versions of it in other contexts, understood its general shape. What he was looking for was the specific, the particular, the clause language that told him not what this document was but what it did. He found it at the bottom of page 1. Contingent legacy asset. Activation threshold conditions met. Effective date logged. He did not move. For exactly 4 seconds, Prince William sat completely still with his eyes on those 3 lines and let the full weight of what they meant arrive without rushing it, without managing it, without organizing it into the kind of composed institutional response he would need to perform for everyone else who was going to walk through that door before this day was over. 4 seconds of just knowing. Then he turned the page. The second page detailed the scope of the stewardship. And this was where the document shifted from legal architecture into something that felt almost personal. The late Queen's private philanthropic portfolio. The charitable endowment she had built over decades, not through ceremony, not through public announcement, but through sustained private commitment to specific causes she had cared about with the quiet intensity of someone who understood that real influence operates below the surface of visibility. William read the list of organizations covered under the Stewardship Authority. He recognized most of them, not from briefings, from memory, from years of watching the woman who had held this family together walk through rooms and speak to people and ask questions in the particular way she asked questions, not to perform interest, but to actually receive the answer. He knew which of these organizations she had visited privately, outside the royal calendar. He knew which causes she had funded without announcement. He knew, in the way that a person knows things about someone they have observed closely across an entire lifetime, that this list was not administrative. It was autobiography, and Louise's name was now attached to it. He sat with that for a moment, Lady Louise Windsor, 20 years old, studying quietly at St. Andrews, competing in carriage-driving events on weekends with the focused discipline of someone who chooses excellence over audience, had just received curatorial authority over the most personal layer of her grandmother's legacy. Not because she had asked for it, because she had been watched. Because over the course of years, that through decisions made in private and conduct maintained without cameras, she had demonstrated something that legal documents cannot manufacture and institutional frameworks cannot assign. She had demonstrated that she understood what the work was actually for. William turned to page 3. The addendum. He had been briefed that it existed. He had not been told exactly what it said. That distinction, knowing something is coming versus reading it for yourself in your own silence, matters more than most people realize. Briefings filter. Documents do not. 3 paragraphs. Dense legal language. He read slowly. The addendum required formal written acknowledgement from a member of the direct line of succession. The language was precise on this point. Not approval, not authorization, not consent. Acknowledgement. The legal distinction was significant. An approving party has discretionary power. An acknowledging party has witnessing authority. William could not stop this. He could not redirect it. He could not negotiate its terms or request modifications to its scope. He could only confirm that it had happened, or refuse to confirm. And refusal. The addendum made this clear in its 3rd paragraph, in language so measured it almost obscured the force of what it was saying, constituted a legal challenge to the validity of the trust itself, a challenge that would require documented grounds, a challenge that would immediately enter the estate's formal dispute resolution process, a challenge that would, within 72 hours, be visible to every attorney connected to the estate's management, and after that, to everyone else. Yes, William set the folder down, looked at his hands on the desk. His left hand was completely still. His right hand had moved, without his awareness, to the edge of the folder, not gripping it, just touching it. The way a person keeps contact with something when they are deciding whether to hold on or let go. He thought about the woman who had written this document. Not the monarch, the woman. He thought about the specific quality of her silence in rooms where decisions were being made. The way she listened without performing listening. The way she assessed without revealing assessment. The way she consistently identified, across 7 decades of watching human nature operate at its most pressurized, exactly which people could be trusted with exactly which responsibilities. She had not written Louise's name into this document casually. And she had not written the acknowledgement clause casually either. Both decisions had been made with the same precise deliberateness that characterized everything she had ever done, which meant the acknowledgement requirement was not a formality. It was a test, not of William's loyalty, of his judgment, of his ability to separate personal discomfort from institutional responsibility, of his willingness to honor a decision that was not his to override simply because overriding it would have been easier. He reached for the pen on the right side of his desk, held it, did not yet write, because there was one more thing he needed to account for before this pen touched paper, and that thing was not legal, not institutional, not covered anywhere in the 3 pages currently open in front of him. That thing was the conversation he had not yet had, but the one that was already waiting for him. He could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Not seeing it yet, but knowing from the pressure in the air, from the particular quality of the silence, from the way the morning had arranged itself around him, that something was moving in his direction that had not yet announced its full intention. His phone lit up on the corner of the desk. One message. He read it without picking the phone up. His expression did not change, but the pen in his right hand went back down on the desk, and he stood up. Because the conversation that had been waiting for him had just decided it was no longer willing to wait. And nothing, not the folder, not the addendum, not the pen sitting unsigned beside it, was going to be resolved until that conversation happened first. William is standing at the exact point where law and loyalty stop being the same thing. He knows what the document requires. He knows what his signature means, but he also knows what walking out of that room without signing it is going to cost, and who is going to be standing on the other side of that cost. What would you do if you were him right now? Sign it and face the storm head on, or walk into that conversation first and risk everything shifting before you get back to the desk? Tell us exactly what you would do in the comments below. Your answer might be more revealing than you think. She already knew. That was the part no one inside William's circle had fully accounted for. That by the time the sealed folder landed on his desk at 4:12 a.m., Queen Camilla's senior advisor, a sharp and measured woman named Adrienne Whitfield, had already been awake for 40 minutes, already dressed, already seated at her own desk 3 floors above a private office in Clarence House with a printed copy of the activation notice in her hand, and a legal pad covered in notes that she had written in a handwriting so controlled it looked like it had been typed. Adrienne Whitfield did not rattle. In 22 years of navigating the interior politics of the British royal household, she had managed press crises that would have ended careers, absorbed information that would have broken most people in half, and consistently delivered counsel that placed institutional stability above personal emotion with the kind of reliability that made her, in the estimation of those who knew how this world actually worked, one of the most consequential people in any room she occupied. She was rattled now, not visibly, not in any way that a camera would catch or that a colleague standing in her doorway would register. But the legal pad in front of her had 3 separate sections, each started and then abandoned, the pen lines pressing harder into the paper toward the end of each section in a way that told the full story her face refused to show. She had read the activation notice twice. Then she had picked up the phone and called the one person she was required to call before anyone else. That call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Adrienne set the phone down, looked at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds, and then wrote 2 words at the top of a fresh page of the legal pad. Containment window. Because that was the real question sitting in the center of this situation. Not whether the trust was legally valid, not whether the activation could be reversed, not even whether Lady Louise Windsor had earned what she had just received. The real question was how much time existed between right now and the moment this became impossible to manage quietly. And the answer, based on what Adrienne already knew about the activation timeline, the acknowledgement requirement, and the attorneys who were certainly already in a room somewhere being very precise and very calm about very serious things, was that the containment window was narrow, uncomfortably narrow. Inside Clarence House that morning, the mood was not fury. This is the first thing to understand about Queen Camilla, because misreading it changes everything. The woman who sat in that private sitting room at 7:15 a.m., dressed and composed, a cup of tea on the table beside her that she had not touched, yet listening to Adrienne Whitfield deliver a precise and structured briefing on what had been activated, what it meant, and what options existed. That woman was not operating from rage. She was operating from strategy. And strategy, when it is practiced at the level Camilla had been practicing it for decades, looks almost identical to calm from the outside. The eyes stay level. The voice stays measured. The questions get asked in a sequence that reveals nothing about the emotional state beneath them and everything about the specific information still needed to form a complete picture. She asked 4 questions. When was the activation logged relative to household notification? What is the scope of the stewardship authority? Does the acknowledgement requirement create a participation window? And C, the 4th question, asked last, as asked quietly, asked with the particular care of someone who already suspects the answer and is asking anyway because they need to hear it confirmed out loud. Is there a mechanism for reconsideration? Adrienne answered all 4. The sequence of her answers, in the order they landed, was the architecture of the problem itself. Activation logged before notification, meaning the household had been positioned as reactive rather than participatory from the first moment. Scope of stewardship covering the most personally significant layer of the late Queen's private legacy, meaning the symbolic weight was maximum, not incidental. Acknowledgement requirement creating a narrow window, meaning the only point of human participation left in this process was sitting on a desk somewhere waiting for a pen. And reconsideration mechanism. Adrienne paused here just briefly. Legally available in theory, but requiring grounds that do not exist in the current facts. Camilla looked at her. Say that plainly, she said. We cannot challenge it, Adrienne said. Not without building a case on a foundation that isn't there. The trust was created with complete legal integrity. The activation met every documented condition. A challenge would fail, and the attempt itself would generate the exact press narrative we cannot afford right now. The room held that. Outside the window, London was fully awake now. The morning had arrived with its full noise and motion, the city indifferent to the conversation happening inside this particular room, the way cities are always indifferent to the conversations that most shape them. Camilla picked up the tea. Set it back down without drinking. Her concern, and here is where the American parallel becomes impossible to ignore, because this story is not foreign, it is universal, was not about money. It was not even at its core about Louise. It was about the particular vulnerability that every person in a blended family dynamic understands from the inside, the vulnerability of being positioned as the one who did not belong to the original story, the one whose presence is tolerated rather than chosen, the one whose legitimacy is always one revelation away from being publicly questioned. Camilla had spent 2 decades building past that vulnerability, not by ignoring it, by outworking it, by showing up with such consistent discipline, such documented service, such undeniable institutional contribution that the narrative had gradually, painfully, shifted. And now here was a document, created before she had been crowned, structured without her input, activated without her knowledge, that reorganized a piece of the late Queen's legacy in a way that her circle had not been consulted on and her household had not been positioned to absorb. That was the wound. Not Louise. Never Louise. The process. Adrienne set 3 typed pages on the table in front of her. A formal written inquiry that had already been submitted to the estate trustees requesting clarification on activation protocol. A memo outlining the 3 potential challenge mechanisms and their respective viability assessments. And a 3rd page, shorter than the others, less formal. That outlined a different kind of option entirely. Not a legal challenge, a conversation, direct, private, between 2 people who both understood that the document on William's desk was only one layer of what needed to be resolved. That beneath the legal layer was a human one. And that human layer, if it was not addressed deliberately and soon, would find its own way to the surface through channels that neither of them could control. Camilla read the 3rd page, looked up at Adrienne. "He needs to know that this is not about stopping it," she said. "It was never about stopping it." Adrienne nodded slowly. "Then what do you need him to understand?" The answer came without hesitation. Not because it was easy, because it had been forming since the moment the activation notice had arrived, building in the back of her mind with the quiet inevitability of a conclusion that had been reached before the question was even fully asked. "Yes, that being excluded from the process is not the same as being excluded from the family," Camilla said. "And that I need him to understand the difference before he walks back into that room and picks up that pen." Adrienne wrote nothing on the legal pad. This was not a note. This was a line drawn in the air between what was manageable and what was not, and which side of that line the next conversation landed on was going to determine whether this remained a private matter resolved with institutional dignity or became something that no amount of careful language could keep from becoming public. She picked up her phone, sent one message, 4 words. She needs 10 minutes. Across London, in a room where a folder sat open on a desk and a pen sat unsigned beside it, a phone lit up with that message. And the person reading it understood immediately that those 4 words were not a request. They were the last available off-ramp before the road ahead became one that none of them had chosen and none of them could control. The question was whether he would take it. Camilla is not asking for the inheritance to be stopped. She is asking for something that no legal document in that folder even thought to address, the right to be part of the conversation before the decision was already final. And that is a completely different ask. Does that change how you see her position? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments right now, because the people watching this story who have lived through blended family dynamics, through feeling excluded from decisions that shape their lives, through watching power move around them rather than through them, those people know exactly what Camilla is feeling in that room. And their perspective matters. Subscribe to this channel right now if you have not already, and turn on every notification because what happens next is where the legal countermove gets attempted. And the moment Devereux Okafor reads what Camilla's circle is proposing, the entire room shifts in a way that nobody in it was prepared for. Share this story. Pass it forward. The comments section of this channel is a space where real conversations happen, and this story deserves one. The document landed on Devereux Okafor's side of the table at 8:43 a.m. He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it first, the way a person looks at something they have been expecting but were quietly hoping would not arrive in the form it has just arrived in. Flat on the polished table. 3 pages, tabbed at 2 specific sections with small yellow markers that told him, before he read a single word, that whoever had prepared this had done so with the kind of thoroughness that signals genuine intent rather than exploratory inquiry. Simone Achebe looked at him from across the table. Marcus Beaumont had already turned his copy face down. That alone told Devereux everything about Marcus's preliminary read. He picked up the document. The proposal from Camilla's legal circle was structured in 3 distinct sections. The first section outlined a formal request for what it called a participation review, a procedural mechanism by which the current reigning household could petition for documented involvement in the activation process on grounds of institutional continuity. The language was careful, sophisticated, written by someone who understood that the argument needed to sound procedural rather than personal, because personal arguments have no standing in estate law and procedural ones, however thin, at least occupy a recognized category. The second section cited the legacy override mechanism. Devereux read that section twice, not because the argument was strong, because he needed to understand exactly how it had been constructed, which precedents it leaned on, which gaps in case history it was attempting to exploit, which interpretive angles it was using to build a structure that looked more solid from a distance than it actually was up close. He set the document down. "They retained Garrison Webb," he said. Simone looked up from her own copy. "How do you know?" "Because this is his architecture," Devereux said. "This section here, the participation review framing, that specific construction of institutional continuity as a grounds for procedural intervention. Webb wrote a brief making a similar argument in a private estate matter in 2019. It did not succeed. But it was close enough to the line that the presiding council took it seriously for longer than it deserved. Garrison Webb was not a name most people outside private estate law would recognize. Inside it, the name carried a specific weight, not the weight of consistent victory, but the weight of consistent creativity. Webb was the attorney you retained when you knew you did not have a strong legal position and needed someone who could build the appearance of one convincingly enough to buy time, generate uncertainty, and create the kind of procedural friction that sometimes caused the opposing side to negotiate simply to avoid the extended cost of resistance. He was, in the estimation of people who had faced him across tables like this one, extraordinarily good at his job, which meant the situation had just become more complicated than it had been 20 minutes ago. "Walk me through the override argument," Marcus said, his voice flat and specific, the voice of a man who wants the information stripped of all interpretation so he can form his own. Devereux turned to the second section. On the legacy override mechanism, the obscure clause buried inside broader estate management frameworks, required 3 documented conditions to be invocable. First, the petitioning household had to demonstrate active institutional standing. Second, the trust in question had to present a verifiable conflict with existing succession or household governance frameworks. Third, the petition had to be filed within a defined window following activation notification. Webb's argument addressed all 3. The first condition, institutional standing, was straightforward. Camilla's household had standing. No one was going to argue otherwise. The second condition, verifiable conflict, was where the argument got creative. Webb was not claiming the trust conflicted with succession law. He was claiming it conflicted with what he called ceremonial governance alignment, the informal but institutionally significant principle that major symbolic realignments within the royal family should involve coordinated household awareness to preserve unified public presentation. Devereux read that phrase again. Ceremonial governance alignment. It was not a legal term. It had never appeared in any binding estate ruling. But it was constructed from real concepts arranged in a sequence that produced the impression of established framework. It was, in the plainest possible terms, a very good argument that rested on a foundation that did not technically exist. "He is going to file for the participation review," Devereux said, "not because he believes it will succeed, because filing it creates a documented procedural dispute. And a documented procedural dispute triggers a mandatory review pause under estate management protocol." Simone looked up sharply. How long is the pause? 14 days? The number sat in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The immediate silence of impact followed by the slow outward movement of everything it touched. 14 days in which the acknowledgement could not be formally processed. 14 days in which the activation, though legally complete, would sit in a kind of institutional suspension. Real, documented, irreversible in its underlying validity, but administratively frozen while the dispute was evaluated. 14 days during which a great many conversations could happen, a great many pressures could be applied, and the landscape around that unsigned acknowledgement could shift in ways that none of the documents in this room had accounted for. Marcus picked his copy up from the table, turned it back over, read the third section, which Devereaux had not yet addressed. The third section was the shortest, 2 paragraphs. No legal citations, no procedural frameworks. Just a direct statement of what Camilla's circle was requesting as an alternative to the full participation review process. A private facilitated meeting between the relevant household principals, conducted before the acknowledgement was signed, with the stated goal of ensuring that all parties had been heard before the process reached its final administrative step. A meeting, not a legal challenge, a conversation. Marcus set the document down again, looked at Devereaux. "Oh, she is offering him a choice," Marcus said. "They sign the acknowledgement and absorb the participation review filing, or take the meeting and give her circle what they are actually asking for, which is not legal standing. It is the appearance of having been consulted." "And if he takes the meeting?" Simone asked. "Then Webb does not file. The review pause does not trigger. The acknowledgement moves forward on the original timeline without procedural interruption." Marcus paused. "And Camilla's circle gets to say, privately and permanently, that they were part of the process." The 3 attorneys looked at each other across the table. None of them said what all of them were thinking, that the choice being presented to William was not really a legal choice at all. It was a human one. Dressed in legal clothing, argued in legal language, I filed through legal channels, but underneath all of that machinery, it was the same choice that human beings and families have been facing since the beginning of time. Do you honor the process at the cost of the relationship, or do you protect the relationship at the cost of the process? And the complication, the one that made this particular version of that ancient choice uniquely difficult, was that honoring the process was also honoring the late Queen's documented intention. While protecting the relationship meant absorbing a meeting that had not been part of her design. Devereaux's phone buzzed on the table. He looked at the screen, turned it face down without responding. "Webb filed 20 minutes ago," he said quietly. Both attorneys across from him went still. The review pause had been triggered. The 14-day window had started. Not because William had refused, not because any negotiation had broken down, because the filing had gone in before anyone in this room had a chance to communicate the meeting option to William's team. Before the offer of a conversation could be accepted, the mechanism designed to create pressure in the absence of that conversation had already been activated. Either Webb had jumped too early, or he had never intended to wait. "He filed before the message reached William," Simone said, yet. "It," Devereaux said, "yeah, I guess I did." Which means, Devereaux said, setting his pen down with the specific care of a man who is managing the precise distance between composure and the edge of it. "That Camilla's circle just told us exactly how serious they are. And William is about to find out that the conversation being offered to him as an alternative to legal escalation has already become legal escalation." Marcus was already reaching for his phone. "Someone needs to be in that room with him when he finds out," he said. "Someone already is," Devereaux said. He stood up from the table, collected his folder, buttoned his jacket with 2 precise movements. "The question is whether whoever is in that room with him knows that the 14 days started 9 minutes ago." He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, turned back once. "And whether William, when he hears that number, understands that 14 days is not time given to him to decide." He looked at both of them across the length of the table. "It is time given to everyone else to move." He left. At the door closed behind him without a sound. And in the silence he left behind, Simone Achebe opened her legal pad to a fresh page and wrote one question at the top in her small, precise handwriting. Not for the record, not for any brief, but for herself. in the way that people who spend their lives inside legal architecture sometimes have to write the human question underneath the legal one just to remember that it exists. The question was 4 words long. What did she know? 14 days. That is what the filing bought. And the people who triggered that clock did not do it by accident and did not do it late. They did it with precision. They did it first. Which means someone in that circle understood something about timing that the other side had not yet fully calculated. Arthur, the question is, what did the late Queen know about this kind of move when she was writing that document? And did she build something into it that nobody has found yet? Leave your theory in the comments right now. Because the readers who are paying close attention to the details of this story are already seeing something that most people are going to miss entirely. And when Chapter 6 reveals what was buried in the delayed activation design, why the late Queen structured the timing the way she did, and what she was protecting against, those theories are going to matter. The document that changed everything was not the trust. It was the attachment nobody had flagged. 11 pages. It appended to the original estate file under a classification marker so routine that 3 separate attorneys had passed over it in the initial review without stopping. The way a person reads past a familiar word without registering it because the brain, efficient and impatient, has already decided it knows what the word means before the eye has finished landing on it. Devereux Okafor found it at 9:17 a.m. He was alone in the review room by then. Simone had stepped out to take a call. Marcus had left to brief a secondary counsel. The building around him had the particular mid-morning quiet of a place that is fully occupied but fully focused. The kind of quiet that is not silence but concentration. Every person in every room doing the specific work in front of them with the awareness that the work matters and that the clock is already running. He almost missed it. The attachment was labeled Supplementary Estate Guidance, internal reference only. The font was smaller than the main document. The margins were tighter. The language in the first 2 pages was so densely procedural that a person moving at reading speed rather than analysis speed would absorb the words without extracting their meaning. Devereux was moving at analysis speed. He stopped at page 3, read 1 paragraph, set the document down on the table with both hands flat beside it, the way a person sets something down when they need a moment before they can continue, when the information has arrived faster than the framework for processing it. And then he picked it back up and read the paragraph again. The late Queen had known, not suspected, not anticipated in the general way that experienced people anticipate friction. Known, specifically, precisely, in documented detail, that the activation of this trust would generate institutional resistance from the reigning household. The supplementary guidance said so directly, in the measured language of someone who had thought carefully about how much to commit to paper and had decided that this particular truth needed to be written down where it could not be denied. The paragraph read, in its essential meaning, as follows. The trust has been structured with a deliberate time delay, not for administrative reasons, but for protective ones. That the elapsed time requirement exists to ensure that the emotional and political environment immediately following a monarchical transition, a period the document characterized, with careful understatement, as one of heightened institutional sensitivity, has fully resolved before the activation brings new symbolic weight into the landscape. She had not just anticipated the friction, she had designed around it. Devereux turned to page 4. The supplementary guidance went further. It outlined, in precise sequential detail, the specific categories of resistance the trust's architects had considered most probable. Optics concerns from the reigning household. Procedural objections raised through estate management channels. Requests for participation review. The possible invocation of override mechanisms. And every category that Garrison Webb's filing had touched. Every pressure point that Camilla's circle had identified and acted on. All of it. Documented, anticipated, addressed. Because on page 5, the supplementary guidance did something that no one in any of the review rooms scattered across London that morning had been told to look for.